The stage lights burned hot, casting a golden halo around Julian Harper as he leaned into the microphone, his fingers dancing across the piano keys. The crowd at the Liberty Arts Festival roared, their cheers a tidal wave of adoration for the liberal musician whose protest songs had become anthems for a generation. Julian was a maestro of defiance, his music a clarion call against those he saw as oppressors. Tonight, though, his performance carried an edge sharper than usual. He had a target, Caroline Leavitt, the conservative politician whose policies he despised. Julian had invited her to the stage for a piano duel, a public stunt meant to mock her. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, expecting a spectacle. But as Julian struck the final chord of his opening song, his eyes caught a figure in the wings, Caroline, standing calmly, her expression unreadable. Something about her quiet confidence unnerved him, and for the first time that night, a flicker of doubt crept into his heart. Julian had spent weeks planning this moment. Caroline Leavitt, a rising star in conservative politics, was everything he stood against. Her speeches, polished and unyielding, championed policies he believed divided the nation. When he'd heard she'd once played piano as a child, he saw an opportunity. He'd challenged her to a duel on social media, framing it as a light-hearted jab, "Let's see if Caroline's as good at music as she is at preaching." The post went viral, and to his surprise, she accepted. Julian imagined her fumbling at the keys, her composure cracking under the spotlight. It would be a triumph, a chance to humiliate her in front of thousands. But now, as he watched her step onto the stage, her navy dress catching the light, he felt a strange tightness in his chest. She didn't look like someone about to be humiliated. She looked prepared. The crowd's cheers turned to murmurs as Caroline took her seat at the second piano, a sleek black Steinway positioned opposite Julian's. He flashed a charismatic grin, leaning into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm welcome to my opponent tonight, Caroline Leavitt." His tone was playful, but the sarcasm was unmistakable. The audience laughed, some clapping, others whispering. Caroline smiled, a small, genuine smile that didn't falter under the weight of the crowd's scrutiny. "Thank you, Julian," she said softly, her voice steady. "I'm honored to be here." The sincerity in her words caught him off guard. He'd expected defensiveness, maybe a barbed retort. Instead, she seemed almost grateful. Julian launched into the rules, his voice booming. "We'll each play a piece, 3 minutes max. No judges, just you, the audience, to decide the winner. I'll go first." He flexed his fingers, cracking his knuckles for effect, and dove into a fiery rendition of one of his own compositions, a protest song reimagined as a virtuosic piano solo. His hands flew across the keys, the melody a cascade of passion and rebellion. The crowd swayed, some singing along, swept up in the raw energy of his performance. As the final note rang out, he stood, bowing dramatically, basking in the applause. "Your move, Caroline," he said, his smirk daring her to fail. Caroline adjusted her seat, her movements deliberate. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering herself, then placed her hands on the keys. The crowd fell silent, curious but skeptical. Julian leaned back, arms crossed, expecting a clumsy attempt at best. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, but they carried a warmth that filled the auditorium. It was Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, a piece Julian knew well, but the way she played it was unlike anything he'd heard. Her fingers moved with a quiet grace, each note infused with a depth of emotion that seemed to reach into the hearts of everyone listening. The melody wasn't flashy or showy. It was intimate, vulnerable, as if she were sharing a piece of her soul. Julian's smirk faded. He watched, transfixed, as Caroline's hands coaxed a story from the keys. The music spoke of sorrow, of resilience, of hope rising from pain. The crowd was spellbound, their earlier skepticism replaced by awe. Julian felt a pang of something he couldn't name, admiration, perhaps, or envy. When she reached the sonata's crescendo, her playing grew bolder, but never lost its tenderness. As the final note lingered in the air, the auditorium erupted in applause, louder and more heartfelt than anything Julian had received. Caroline looked up, her eyes glistening, and for a moment, their gazes met. There was no triumph in her expression, only gratitude. Julian's mind reeled. He'd underestimated her, and not just as a musician. The crowd was on its feet, chanting her name, but Caroline didn't bask in the moment. Instead, she stood and walked to the microphone, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you," she said. "I haven't played in years, but tonight felt right. Music has always been my refuge, a way to connect with something bigger than myself. I hope you felt that too." The sincerity in her words pierced Julian. He'd planned to mock her, to use this moment to tear her down, but she'd turned it into something beautiful, something unifying. The host called for the audience to vote by applause, but Julian raised a hand, stopping the proceedings. His heart pounded as he stepped to the microphone. "Wait," he said, his voice unsteady. "Before we do that, I need to say something." The crowd quieted, sensing a shift. Julian swallowed hard, his carefully crafted persona crumbling. "I challenged Caroline tonight to make a point, to prove I was better, not just at music, but as a person. I thought I knew who she was, what she stood for. But I was wrong." His voice cracked, and he paused, gathering himself. "Her music, it showed me something I've forgotten. Music isn't about winning or tearing someone down. It's about reaching people, about kindness. Caroline, you reminded me of that tonight. Thank you." The auditorium was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Caroline's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. Then, slowly, she smiled, a smile that carried no judgment, only understanding. The crowd began to clap, not for one performer or the other, but for the moment itself, for the unexpected bridge built between two people who seemed worlds apart. But the story didn't end there. As the applause faded, Caroline stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "Julian, can I share something?" He nodded, still reeling from his own confession. She turned to the audience, her hands clasped tightly. "When I was a girl, my mother was sick for a long time. She loved music, but we couldn't afford lessons. A neighbor, an older man who played piano, offered to teach me for free. He said music could heal, could bring people together. I played for my mother every night, and even when she was too weak to speak, she'd smile. That's why I accepted Julian's challenge, not to compete, but to honor her, to share that gift again." Tears pricked Julian's eyes. He thought of his own childhood, of the grandmother who'd taught him piano, her hands gnarled but gentle as she guided his fingers. He'd lost sight of why he'd started playing, consumed by fame and ideology. Caroline's story was a mirror, reflecting his own forgotten truths. The crowd was hushed, many wiping away tears, moved by the raw humanity of her words. Then came the moment that would be remembered long after the festival ended. Caroline turned to Julian, her eyes bright with an idea. "Julian, would you play with me? Not against me, but together. One song, for everyone here." The invitation hung in the air, a challenge of a different kind. Julian hesitated, his pride warring with something deeper. Then he nodded, a small, genuine smile breaking through. "Let's do it." They sat at their pianos, side by side, and after a brief whispered discussion, they chose "Amazing Grace." Julian began, his chords rich and soulful, and Caroline joined in, her melody weaving seamlessly with his. Their styles were different, his bold and passionate, hers tender and precise, but together, they created something transcendent. The crowd swayed, some singing softly, others holding hands, strangers united by the music. It was more than a performance, it was an act of compassion, a reminder that beneath their differences, people shared a common heart. As the final note faded, Julian and Caroline stood, facing each other. The crowd rose in a standing ovation, but for a moment, the two musicians were in their own world. Julian extended his hand, and Caroline took it, their grip firm and warm. "I'm sorry," he whispered, too low for the microphone to catch. "Thank you for showing me a better way." She squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. "We all get lost sometimes," she said. "The music brings us back." The festival continued, but the piano duel became its defining moment, a story shared across news outlets and social media. Clips of Julian's confession and their duet went viral, not for the spectacle, but for the message, that kindness could bridge divides, that music could heal. Julian returned to his music with a new purpose, his songs now carrying a softer, more inclusive tone. Caroline, too, found her voice amplified, using her platform to advocate for music education in underserved communities, inspired by the neighbor who taught her. Months later, Julian sat at his piano, composing a new piece. It was called "The Bridge," dedicated to Caroline and the night that changed him. As his fingers moved across the keys, he thought of the crowd's faces, of Caroline's courage, of the way music had stripped away their armor and revealed their shared humanity. He smiled, his heart full. The world was fractured, but moments like these, moments of unexpected connection, of selflessness and grace, were the notes that could mend it. And as long as there was music, there was hope. Moral. The moral of the story is that kindness and humility can bridge divides, transforming conflict into connection. By setting aside pride and embracing shared humanity, we can find common ground, even with those we initially oppose, and create moments of unity that inspire hope and healing.